Okay, so today we're diving into something uh, pretty fundamental to the whole human experience, right? Ethics. And, you sent us some really interesting stuff that gets into how we as humans just grapple with this question of right and wrong constantly. Like it's this inherent thing in us, this desire to figure out like how to navigate the moral landscape. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating how, for centuries really, brilliant minds have tried to map this out. They've tried to come up with systems for how we approach these questions. And your sources, they highlight three main frameworks, I guess you could say: teleological, deontological, and virtue-based ethics. It's like you were saying, different lenses. They each offer this unique perspective on those super fundamental questions, right? Like, what is good and why is it good? And where do we even find the answer? Where does it all come from?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then your sources, they introduce this idea of normative ethics. And from what I'm gathering, it seems like that's where philosophers are going beyond just trying to identify what's right and wrong and are actually developing theories, systems about the best way to live.
Yeah.
It's not just like pondering, it's about building a framework for how we evaluate our actions, whether that's based on their outcome, our duties, even our motivations.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we even start with all these different approaches? Where do we begin?
Well, I think a natural place to begin is with what's called teleological ethics. And sometimes it's referred to as consequentialist ethics.
Okay.
And the idea here, like your sources explain, is that the morality of an action, it's determined entirely by its consequences. Have you ever heard that phrase, the end justifies the means?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's the core of this teleological thinking. It's saying that the resulting, good or bad, that's the most important thing. So intentions, rules, those kind of take a backseat.
Okay, so it's really all about the result. So if an action leads to something good, it's morally right. And if it leads to a negative outcome, then it's wrong.
Exactly. Your source makes this point that an action is right if it produces at least as much good as any other possible choice.
Okay.
And what's really important here, and the source makes this distinction, teleologists, they look at what's called the non-moral value that actions bring about. And that helps them figure out the moral worth. So, for example, happiness, right? We wouldn't say happiness is morally good in itself,
Right.
but it's a good thing. And then if something brings about happiness, that's what makes it a morally good action.
Okay.
It avoids that circular reasoning of just saying, well, this is good because it leads to more good.
I see. Makes sense. But then the source starts talking about all these different, versions of teleological ethics, right? Based on whose good we're actually trying to promote. And that's where we get ethical egoism and then ethical universalism.
Yeah, exactly. So, ethical egoism, on one hand, it argues that we should ultimately be acting to promote our own self-interest, our own greatest good in the long run. And the source mentions thinkers like Epicurus, Hobbes, and Nietzsche.
Wow.
They all kind of fit into this. And then we have ethical universalism or utilitarianism. And that takes this much broader view, right? It says we should aim for the greatest good for everyone, the greatest balance of good over evil in the whole universe. And then there you have Bentham and Mill as the big names associated with this idea.
Right. Okay, so let's dive into that ethical egoism idea for a minute. Because it does seem kind of counterintuitive to how many people think about ethics, right? It sounds like It's all about looking out for number one.
Right.
Which seems to go against this idea that morality should be about being concerned for others.
Yeah, that's exactly the tension, isn't it? That ethical egoism tries to address. The ethical egoist would say that prioritizing yourself, it's not just okay, it's actually the right thing to do morally. It's the proper way to act.
Uh-huh.
Your source uses this example of the Good Samaritan and how he stopped to help someone, but then he ended up getting killed.
Right.
And the ethical egoist would say, well, actually, that was the wrong thing to do. He didn't prioritize his own well-being. He sacrificed his own good for someone else.
Wow. That's a tough way to look at it. It's hard to wrap your head around that.
Yeah.
But the source mentions this twisted golden rule that ethical egoism seems to embrace. It's like treat others well so that they will treat you well in return. Like self-interest disguised as kindness.
Yeah, I got it. The underlying motivation, it's all about the self. It's completely self-centered. And the source goes into this whole psychological argument that is often used to defend this idea. It says, look, everyone's driven by self-interest, ultimately.
Right.
That's what's called psychological egoism. And it says that if we can't be obligated to do something that we're simply not capable of doing, then altruism, acting purely for the sake of others, it can never be a moral obligation because it contradicts our basic self-interested nature.
Okay, so even helping others for an ethical egoist isn't necessarily wrong, but it's only justified if you are ultimately the one who benefits. Like, I could see this playing out in a business context where maybe it makes sense to help your business partner succeed because ultimately their success helps you too. But maybe going out of your way to help a stranger is less likely.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good example. And the source makes it clear that it doesn't say you have to harm others, but the reason to help them or not harm them ultimately always comes down to how it affects you. So it really is a perspective that puts the individual, front and center in their moral universe.
Okay. Now the source also gets into this idea of psychological egoism. This idea that, like, we're just programmed to be selfish, right? That it's just human nature to be motivated by self-interest. It sounds like that's a common foundation for ethical egoism, but the source makes this really important point that you can't just go from an is to an ought.
Right, right.
Just because something is a certain way doesn't mean it should be that way.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. And you see this a lot, not just in ethics, but all over philosophy. So yeah, just because we might be psychologically predisposed, to act in certain ways, to act selfishly, that doesn't mean it's morally right. But the egoists might push back and say, well, it's just not realistic to expect people to consistently act against their own nature.
Right. I can see that argument. And there's this really interesting back and forth in the source about, like, the nature of our desires, right? Like, it argues that most of our desires, they're not for our own welfare directly, but for specific things. Like, I desire food or a promotion at work or seeing my family happy. And even if I feel good after helping someone, the source says that good feeling, that's a result of wanting to help, not the cause of it. Like, we don't help others because it makes us feel good. We feel good because we already wanted to help. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And the source uses this great example about someone who wants another person to, like, experience the beauty of a particular place. If they make that happen and then they feel satisfaction, it wasn't that satisfaction that was the goal. The goal was the other person's enjoyment. So that really challenges this idea that, like, all of our actions are just aimed at, satisfying ourselves.
Okay, so that's egoism. Now let's switch gears to its opposite.
Yeah.
At least in terms of scope, right? So utilitarianism. This is where we move from me to the greatest good for the greatest number. And the source uses this really, like, thought-provoking scenario. It's about this dying millionaire who wants to leave his money to this very specific organization versus donating it to save thousands of people from starving. It's like a real gut check moment for those simple moral rules like keep your promises or follow your conscience.
Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench in things. And I think it shows perfectly how utilitarianism, as this consequentialist theory, it just looks at the outcome. So yeah, maybe keeping a promise, to someone who's passed away, it feels intuitively right. But the utilitarian would probably say, well, what leads to the most good? Saving all those lives and preventing that suffering.
Right.
So it really forces us to weigh different values, to think about the impact our choices have on a larger scale.
I see. Okay, and then the source dives into kind of the history of utilitarianism, starting with Epicurus and this idea of pleasure, and then moving toward this idea of, like, general happiness with Bentham and Mill. So what are, like, the key differences between how they approach this?
Well, Bentham, his version, it's often called hedonistic utilitarianism.
Okay.
And his core idea is this. Pleasure is the ultimate good. Pain is the only evil.
Okay.
And he even came up with this system for measuring pleasure and pain.
Wow.
It's called the hedonic calculus. And it has these, like, 7 aspects, things like intensity, duration, certainty, all these different ways to quantify pleasure and pain. So you can imagine in that millionaire example, Bentham would say, okay, let's figure out, how many units of happiness will be created by giving the money to that organization versus how many units of happiness would be created by saving all those people. And whichever one leads to more happiness, well, that's the right thing to do.
Wow, that's so interesting. And kind of, it sounds very straightforward, logical. But as the source explains, there were some people who weren't totally satisfied with that.
Right.
And that leads to Mill, his approach, his eudaimonistic utilitarianism. So what did Mill do to change or refine Bentham's framework?
So Mill agreed with the basic idea, right? Maximizing happiness, the greatest good. But He argued that not all pleasures are equal, and this is a big idea in Mill's thinking.
Okay.
He made this distinction between what he called higher pleasures, which are things like intellectual, aesthetic, social, and then the lower pleasures, which are more like sensual, physical, like eating or drinking. And his argument is that the higher pleasures, even if they're not as immediately intense, they're still more valuable.
Hmm.
He has that famous quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied."
Right, right. Yeah, I've heard that one.
So for Mill, it wasn't just about the quantity of pleasure, but also the quality. And his idea of happiness was much broader. It included things like knowledge, freedom, friendship, health, what we might call human flourishing.
Right, right. So it's not just about feeling good,
Mm.
but about living a fulfilling life.
Exactly.
Okay, okay. And now the source talks about act and rule utilitarianism. This seems like a really important distinction in how we actually apply utilitarianism, right? Like, are we trying to maximize good in every single instance? Or are we trying to set up rules that will generally lead to good outcomes, even if sometimes we have to make tough choices?
Yeah, you got it. That's the central tension. So act utilitarianism, that's more in line with Bentham.
Right.
And it basically says, for every single action, every situation you're in, you have to ask what will produce the greatest good in this particular case.
Okay.
But, and the source brings this up, that's not always realistic.
Yeah, this sounds exhausting.
Right, it's almost impossible. So rule utilitarianism, that's often associated more with Mill. And it says that, okay, instead of trying to calculate the consequences every single time, we should figure out what general rules, if everybody followed them, would lead to the most good overall.
Okay, so instead of asking, is it okay to lie in this specific situation?
Right.
We should ask, would a rule that says lying is always wrong lead to more happiness in the long run?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
It's about the big picture.
The source uses that classic trolley car dilemma to illustrate this. The act utilitarian might say, pull the lever, save the 5 lives, even if it means one person dies, because they're just looking at that immediate outcome. But the rule utilitarian might say, wait, if we start saying it's okay to intentionally harm someone, even if it saves more lives, what does that do to our society? Does that make us less safe?
Yeah, that's a great illustration. It really forces you to think about the potential consequences of those kinds of actions being permissible in general.
Exactly, exactly. Now, the source also outlines some strengths of utilitarianism. It does offer this really clear, simple principle. Maximize utility. It's focused on something that seems like it should be the core of morality.
Right.
Promoting well-being, reducing suffering for as many people as possible. And it also seems really relevant to, like, how we think about our obligations to future generations. Because their happiness, their suffering, that all factors into the calculation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes this long view of morality, which I think is important.
Yeah. But like with any theory that tries to encompass so much, there are definitely some criticisms of utilitarianism.
Of course.
The source lists quite a few. Like just starting with the idea of like the greatest happiness for the greatest number. What happens when we have to choose between maximizing the total amount of happiness versus the average? Like, do we want a society with tons of people who are only slightly happy, or a smaller society with fewer people who are super happy? And how do you even measure that?
Yeah, those are tough questions. And then you have the very real problem of actually trying to predict the consequences of our actions. It's basically impossible to know for sure what will happen, especially over the long term. The source calls this the comparative consequences objection.
Yeah.
How do we really compare all these possible outcomes, especially when they stretch out into the future and involve so many people?
Right. Yeah, it gets really complex. And then there's this consistency objection to rule utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Like if we can always break a rule in a specific situation to maximize utility, then doesn't it just collapse back into act utilitarianism? Or even just become like, well, any other system where you just decide what you want to do?
Yeah, it raises some questions about how consistent rule utilitarianism can actually be in practice.
Yeah. And then there's some really like practical objections. The no rest objection. Like, if we're always supposed to be maximizing utility, when do we ever get to just, like, chill out?
Yeah.
And the publicity objection, maybe it's actually better if most people don't try to be strict utilitarians because the calculations are just too difficult.
Right.
Right. And then there's the idea that different cultures might come up with totally different rules based on what they think will maximize utility in their society. It leads to this relativism objection.
Yeah, all these are important points to consider. But I think some of the strongest criticisms, the ones that really give people pause, are those that focus on the potential for utilitarianism to justify actions that just feel wrong. Like the ends justifying the means.
Right, right. The source gives some really disturbing hypotheticals, like deceit, torture, slavery, even harming minorities, if it could somehow be argued to benefit the majority. That doesn't sit well with a lot of people.
It doesn't. And the source kind of formalizes this into a logical argument. It says, if a moral theory justifies actions that we all think are just, like, absolutely wrong, then we have to reject that theory.
Right.
And a lot of people argue that utilitarianism does seem to allow for those kinds of actions, at least in some extreme hypothetical cases.
Yeah. And then there's the whole lying objection. Like, what if lying actually did lead to a better outcome in a specific situation? Could a utilitarian really say we shouldn't lie?
Right.
And then the justice objection, which I think is the most powerful one, the source gives these really chilling examples, like framing an innocent person to prevent a riot, or sacrificing a healthy person so their organs can save multiple other people. It just clashes so strongly with our ideas about fairness, individual rights, the value of each person.
It does. And, a utilitarian might say, well, in some extreme cases, like maybe if sacrificing one person could prevent something truly catastrophic. And they use the example of like setting off a small nuclear bomb to prevent a much bigger one. But even then, you're still left with this really uncomfortable feeling like, is it ever okay to sacrifice an innocent person, no matter what the potential benefits are? It raises these really deep questions about the sanctity of life and the limits of just looking at outcomes. And even when utilitarians try to come up with rules or exceptions or workarounds to justify those kinds of actions, it still doesn't quite sit right for a lot of people. The source even connects this to some really difficult historical decisions, like the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, and even everyday situations like car accidents. We know that innocent people will die in car accidents, but we still accept that risk as a society, right? So these are tough questions that utilitarianism really forces us to grapple with.
Wow. Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, so the source wraps up utilitarianism with this three-step formula, right? First, figure out what the likely consequences are of different actions. Then try to calculate how much happiness or suffering each action will cause. And finally, choose the action that leads to the most happiness for the most people. And it all boils down to that core principle, that moral rightness depends on the consequences for everyone involved. It all comes back to the principle of utility. And then the source poses this question to students: do you think the end always justifies the means? And it uses these examples of doctors maybe not being completely honest with patients or prescribing medication that maybe isn't strictly necessary. Those examples really make you think about how we might be tempted to like bend the rules or justify things that are maybe a little shady if we think it will lead to a good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And that question, it really gets to the heart of what makes utilitarianism so challenging, but also so relevant, I think.
Absolutely. And then the source touches on altruism briefly. This idea, acting in a way that benefits others at your own expense. It contrasts it with psychological egoism and uses that really powerful example of someone risking their life to save a child. It makes you question, is everything we do really motivated by self-interest?
Yeah, a very powerful image.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time on teleological ethics.
Right.
And now let's move on to the second big framework from your sources, deontological ethics. And the source points out this is really the opposite of utilitarianism in many ways. Instead of looking at consequences, deontology focuses on rules, duties, obligations. It's all about the means justifies the end. Right.
Exactly. The emphasis shifts. So deontology says that whether an action is right or wrong, it's determined by something other than just the outcome. It could be about things like keeping promises, being fair, following moral rules, those kinds of things. And it says that some moral obligations, they're just absolute. You have to follow them no matter what.
Okay, so the source then discusses Pufendorf and how he categorized these different duties, duties toward God, toward ourselves, toward others. It talks about absolute duties like not harming others, treating people equally, promoting the good of others, and then also conditional duties like keeping promises.
Yeah.
So from the get-go, it does seem much more focused on rules and principles than utilitarianism.
Definitely, yeah. And one really prominent example of deontological ethics that the source gets into is called divine command theory.
Okay.
or DCT for short. And DCT basically says all ethical principles, they're just God's commands.
Okay.
So morality originates with God. Something is right if God wills it. It's wrong if it goes against God's will.
Okay. So that means that something isn't wrong because it causes harm or suffering, but just because God said so.
Right.
And the reverse is true. Something is good just because God commands it. So without God, does that mean there's no morality at all?
Yeah, that's kind of the radical claim that DCT makes. And the source outlines some of the implications of that idea. Like, if there's no God, then nothing is really right or wrong.
Wow.
It leads to this idea of moral nihilism.
Okay. But the source also points out some problems with that theory, right?
Yeah.
Like, if good is just whatever God commands, then doesn't that make the statement God is good kind of meaningless? It's like saying God is whatever God is. It doesn't really tell us anything. And also, and this one's really hard to get around, it makes morality seem completely arbitrary. Like God could command us to do something horrible, and according to DCT, we'd be obligated to obey.
Right, that's one of the big challenges that DCT faces, the problem of arbitrariness. How do we know that God's commands are actually good if goodness is just defined as whatever God commands? It's a circular argument.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, so then the source gets into rights theory, which is another kind of duty-based approach.
Right.
It talks about rights as justified claims that we have against others, and this idea that rights and duties always go together. Like if I have a right to something, then other people have a duty to respect that right.
That's called the correlativity of rights and duties.
Right. And the source mentions John Locke and his concept of natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, and how that influenced the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which talks about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's really interesting to see how these ideas have shaped like our legal and political systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Rights theory is it's central to a lot of modern thinking about ethics and about how society should be structured.
Okay, so now we get to, I think, the biggest name in deontological ethics. Immanuel Kant.
Right.
The categorical imperative. And the source emphasizes that Kant was really against the idea that consequences determine morality. Like for him, it's all about the intention behind an action. Like, are you doing the right thing for the right reasons?
Yeah.
And that the rightness or wrongness of the action itself, that exists regardless of the outcome.
Exactly.
So for Kant, we have these absolute moral obligations that we can figure out using reason.
Right. And that's where the categorical imperative comes in.
Okay, so explain that a bit more.
Okay, so for Kant, the categorical imperative, it's this one overarching principle of duty. It's like the moral law.
Okay.
And it's based on reason, not on our desires or whims. It's different from what he called hypothetical imperatives, which are like, if you want this, then you should do that.
Okay, I see.
The categorical imperative is more like, this is what you should do, period, no matter what you want. And the only thing for Kant that's good without any qualification is what he called a goodwill. And by that, he meant acting out of a sense of duty.
Right.
Following the moral law because it's the right thing to do, not because you hope to get something out of it.
Okay. And the most famous formulation of the categorical imperative is, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will live, that it should become a universal law.
Right.
So, and the source uses that example of making a false promise. Like if everyone broke their promises, the whole idea of a promise would just like dissolve. It wouldn't work anymore.
No. So it's not about what the consequences of breaking a promise would be for you or for the other person. It's about whether the principle behind your action, your maxim, could logically be universalized.
Okay, so it's about logical consistency, not just predicting outcomes.
Right, yeah. And Kant gives us a few other versions or formulations of this categorical imperative. One is what are called the principle of universality.
Okay.
And this one says basically that we should choose our actions, our maxims, in a way that we could rationally want everyone to follow them without it leading to a contradiction. So, like with stealing. If everyone stole, then the whole idea of property wouldn't make sense anymore. There'd be no point in owning anything. So the maxim, it's okay to steal, leads to a contradiction when you try to universalize it. That's why stealing is wrong. And Kant talks about perfect duties, which are things that are always wrong, like stealing or lying.
Right.
And then imperfect duties, which are things that are good to do, but not necessarily obligatory in every instance.
Okay.
Like developing your talents or helping others. You're not a bad person if you don't help every single person you encounter, but it's still good to do.
Okay, so So the perfect duties are those where the opposite would lead to a logical contradiction if universalized.
Exactly.
And the imperfect duties, those are more like things that would be nice if everyone did them, but it wouldn't necessarily make the world fall apart if they didn't.
Right.
Okay.
And then there's the second formulation, which is all about treating people with respect. It's called the principle of humanity as an end, never as merely a means. It basically says that we should never treat other people as just tools to achieve our own goals. We should recognize their inherent worth and dignity. And the source gives examples like slavery, exploitation, prostitution. All of those things are wrong because they treat people as means to an end rather than ends in themselves.
Right. Yeah, they're denying people's autonomy, their ability to make their own choices.
Yeah, exactly. And Kant even applies this principle to ourselves. Like, he argues against suicide because that's treating your own life as just a means to escape suffering instead of respecting it as an end in itself.
Okay, I see.
And then there's the third formulation, which is called the principle of autonomy. It emphasizes the idea that we should act as if we're both the creators and the subjects of the moral law.
Okay.
So we should follow the rules that we would want everyone else to follow as well. It's all about this idea of a universal kingdom of ends, where everyone is both a lawgiver and a law follower.
That's a pretty profound idea.
It is, but like any ethical theory, it's not without its criticisms. And one of the main ones that the source highlights is this idea of, like, rigidity. Kant seems really strict, uncompromising in his rules, and this leads to some difficult dilemmas, like that famous axe murderer at the door scenario.
Oh, yeah, right.
You know, what do you do if someone's at your door and they want to kill someone who's hiding inside and they ask if that person is there?
Right.
According to Kant, you can't lie, even to save someone's life.
Wow, that's a tough one.
It is, and there are other examples like that, like someone holding a gun to your mother's head and telling you to do something you know is wrong.
Wow.
It seems like in those situations, the strict rules just don't give us the right answer.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there are exceptions to these rules, or maybe if there's a way to, like, prioritize them when they conflict. And that's where W.D. Ross comes in, right?
Right. The source talks about his idea of prima facie duties, which he called moral guidelines. So prima facie basically means, like, at first glance or on the face of it.
Okay.
And his idea is that, yeah, there are these moral duties that generally obligate us. You know, most of the time we should follow them, but they're not absolute. There might be situations where other moral considerations outweigh them.
Okay, I'm following you.
So our actual duty, the thing we actually ought to do, it comes from weighing all these different prima facie duties and figuring out which one is most important in a given situation.
Okay, so it's like there are guidelines, not hard and fast rules.
Right.
And the source lists 7 of these prima facie duties that Ross identified.
Yeah, things like fidelity, keeping promises, telling the truth.
Right.
Reparation, making up for harm you've caused. Gratitude, being thankful to those who've helped you. Justice, being fair and impartial. Beneficence, acting to benefit others. Self-improvement, working to improve yourself. And then non-maleficence, avoiding harming others. And the source mentions Thoreau adding a duty to prevent harm to others as well. So you can imagine you might find yourself in a situation where 2 of these duties conflict.
Right, like what if you promise to meet a friend, but then you see someone who needs help?
Exactly. Then you have to decide what's the most important duty in this situation. Do you keep your promise or do you help the person in need? Ross didn't give us a strict formula for figuring this out. He thought it relied on our moral intuition.
Okay, so it's like using our best judgment to figure out what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, and he actually thought that we just kind of, like, intuit these fundamental duties.
Oh.
You know, they're not based on some complex argument. They just seem self-evident to us. And the source has this activity where you imagine being the prime minister of Ethiopia.
Right.
And you have to decide what principles you'll use.